Thomas Whitmore had served the British royal family for 23 years. His weathered hands gripped the ceremonial sword at his side as he walked through the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. At 53 years old, Thomas had seen 3 generations of royals come and go, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The palace was buzzing with unusual activity that Tuesday morning in March. Staff members whispered in corners, their voices dropping to silence whenever Thomas passed by. Something was different, and his trained instincts told him it wasn't good news. As the senior guard of the portrait gallery wing, Thomas took pride in protecting the royal family's most treasured artworks and memories. The portrait gallery held centuries of royal history. Kings and queens from ages past looked down from their gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow visitors as they moved through the halls. But there was one portrait that had become particularly special to Thomas over the past few years. It was the official portrait of Catherine, the Princess of Wales, painted by renowned artist Jonathan Yeo just 2 years after her marriage to Prince William. Thomas remembered the day the portrait was unveiled. Catherine had stood beside it, radiant in her blue dress, as photographers captured the moment. The painting showed her gentle smile and kind eyes, qualities that had made her beloved by the British people and the palace staff alike. Thomas had been there that day, standing at attention in his crisp uniform, proud to be protecting such an important moment in royal history. The portrait had become a favorite among visitors to the palace. School children would point at it with excitement, and elderly visitors would smile warmly when they saw Catherine's painted face. Thomas had noticed how the painting seemed to bring joy to people, just like the real Catherine did when she walked these halls. She always had a kind word for the staff, remembering their names and asking about their families. But today felt different. As Thomas made his morning rounds, he noticed several palace administrators huddled in deep conversation near the portrait gallery entrance. Their faces were serious, and they kept glancing toward Catherine's portrait. Thomas had learned to read the signs of palace politics over his many years of service. The way people carried themselves, the hushed conversations, the nervous energy in the air, it all pointed to something significant happening behind the scenes. The relationship between the royal family members had always been complex, but lately, things had become more strained. Thomas had witnessed the subtle tensions during formal events, the careful positioning during photo opportunities, and the way certain family members seemed to avoid each other in the palace corridors. As someone who had dedicated his life to serving the crown, Thomas tried to stay neutral and professional, but he couldn't help but notice the changes in the palace atmosphere. Queen Camilla had been asserting her position more firmly since becoming queen consort. Thomas had observed her making various changes around the palace, some small and some more significant. She had rearranged seating at state dinners, changed certain protocols, and had been vocal about her opinions on palace decorations and traditions. Some staff members whispered that she was trying to put her own stamp on the monarchy, while others defended her right to make changes as the new queen consort. Thomas had always respected the chain of command. His job was to follow orders from his superiors and protect the royal family and their property. But something about the atmosphere today made him uneasy. He had developed a sixth sense about palace drama over the years, and every instinct was telling him that a storm was brewing. As he continued his patrol, Thomas thought about his own family. His wife Margaret worked as a seamstress in the palace laundry, and their daughter Emily was studying art history at university. Partly inspired by growing up around the royal collection, this job wasn't just employment for Thomas, it was a calling, a way of life that his family had embraced. The thought of compromising his principles made his stomach tighten with worry. The morning progressed with an increasing sense of tension. Thomas noticed more administrators than usual walking through the portrait gallery, taking notes and having quiet discussions. Some carried clipboards and seemed to be cataloging the artworks. Others took photographs with their phones, which was unusual since documentation of the royal collection was typically handled by professional archivists. Around 11 o'clock, Thomas was approached by James Fletcher, the deputy master of the household. James was a thin man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually worried expression. Thomas had known James for over a decade, and they had always maintained a professional but friendly relationship. "Thomas, I need to speak with you privately," James said, glancing around nervously. "Perhaps we could step into the small office behind the gallery?" Thomas followed James into the cramped office space that was used for storage and administrative tasks related to the portrait gallery. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets containing documentation about every piece in the royal collection. James closed the door behind them and took a deep breath before speaking. "Thomas, I'm going to be direct with you because I respect your years of service and your dedication to this family," James began. "There are going to be some changes made to the portrait gallery, and I wanted to give you advance notice." Thomas felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. "What kind of changes, sir?" James removed his glasses and cleaned them nervously, a habit Thomas had noticed whenever the man was uncomfortable. "Her Majesty Queen Camilla has decided that certain portraits need to be relocated to make room for new additions to the collection. It's part of a broader reorganization of the palace's artistic holdings." "Which portraits are being moved?" Thomas asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. James put his glasses back on and looked directly at Thomas. "The portrait of the Princess of Wales will be moved to a storage facility. Her Majesty feels that the current arrangement doesn't properly reflect the hierarchy of the royal family." Thomas felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He had expected some kind of political maneuvering, but this was more direct than he had imagined. The portrait of Catherine wasn't just any painting. It was a symbol of hope and continuity for the monarchy's future. Removing it would send a clear message, and not a positive one. "When is this supposed to happen?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "This afternoon," James replied. "A team from the Royal Collection Trust will be here at 2 o'clock to carefully remove the portrait and transport it to the storage facility in Windsor. I'm telling you because your cooperation will be necessary to ensure the process goes smoothly." Thomas looked around the small office, his mind racing. 23 years of faithful service had led to this moment. Being asked to facilitate what felt like an act of petty jealousy disguised as administrative reorganization. He thought about Catherine's kindness to the staff, her dedication to her royal duties, and the way she had brought a fresh energy to the monarchy that reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place. "Sir, may I ask what will replace the portrait?" Thomas inquired. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "A new portrait of Her Majesty Queen Camilla will be commissioned and installed in that location. It's a prominent position, and Her Majesty feels it would be more appropriate for the Queen Consort to be displayed there." The political implications were now crystal clear to Thomas. This wasn't about reorganization or making space, it was about establishing dominance and sending a message about who held real power in the palace hierarchy. Catherine's portrait was being removed not because it was inappropriate or out of place, but because its presence apparently bothered Queen Camilla. Thomas stood up slowly, his mind made up about what he needed to do. "Sir, I appreciate you telling me about this in advance. However, I have some concerns about the process that I'd like to discuss with the master of the household before any action is taken." James looked alarmed. "Thomas, this order comes directly from Her Majesty. There isn't room for discussion or delay. The decision has been made." "I understand the order has been given," Thomas replied carefully. "But as the senior guard responsible for this wing, I have a duty to ensure that all proper protocols are followed before any artwork is moved. I need to verify that the appropriate documentation has been completed and that the insurance and security arrangements are in place." This was partially true. There were indeed protocols for moving valuable artworks, but Thomas was really buying time to figure out his next move. He knew that once Catherine's portrait was removed and placed in storage, it would likely never return to public display. The message would be sent, and the damage would be done. James stood up as well, his frustration becoming more apparent. "Thomas, I understand your dedication to protocol, but this is not a request. This is a direct order from the Queen Consort. Your job is to facilitate this process, not to question it." "My job," Thomas said quietly but firmly, "is to protect the royal family and their property. Sometimes that means protecting them from decisions that might not be in their best interests." The tension in the small room was now palpable. James realized that Thomas was not going to simply comply with the order, and Thomas realized that his career was about to take a dramatic turn. Neither man spoke for several long moments as they stared at each other, each understanding that this conversation would have consequences far beyond the immediate situation. Finally, James broke the silence. Thomas, I'm going to pretend this conversation never happened and give you one more chance to reconsider your position. The removal team will be here at 2 o'clock. I strongly advise you to cooperate fully. Thomas nodded slowly. I appreciate the warning, sir. I'll be ready for them. As James left the office, Thomas remained behind, staring at the filing cabinets that contained decades of documentation about the royal collection. He thought about his oath of service, his loyalty to the crown, and his responsibility to do what was right rather than what was convenient. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of a painting, but the course of the rest of his life. Thomas spent the next hour walking through the portrait gallery, studying Catherine's portrait with new eyes. The painting captured her at age 30, shortly after her marriage to Prince William. The artist had skillfully portrayed her natural elegance and warmth, qualities that had made her a favorite among the British public. Her gentle smile seemed to embody the hope that many people placed in the younger generation of royals. The gallery was unusually quiet that Tuesday afternoon. Normally, there would be a steady stream of staff members and occasional visitors walking through the corridor, but today felt different. Thomas suspected word had gotten out about what was planned, and people were staying away to avoid being caught up in the drama. Palace staff had a keen sense of when to make themselves scarce during political situations. As Thomas stood before the portrait, he reflected on his years of service. He had joined the Royal Guard as a young man of 28, full of pride and determination to serve his country through serving the royal family. Over the decades, he had witnessed moments of great joy and profound sadness within the palace walls. He had been present during state visits, royal weddings, and solemn occasions of mourning. Through it all, his role had been to remain neutral, professional, and dedicated to protecting the institution of the monarchy. But this situation felt different from the usual palace politics. Thomas had observed enough royal dynamics to understand that family tensions were normal and expected. What bothered him was the symbolism of removing Catherine's portrait. She represented the future of the monarchy in the public mind, and her charitable work and dedication to her royal duties had helped modernize the institution's image. Removing her portrait felt like a step backward, a return to the petty jealousies that had damaged the monarchy's reputation in previous decades. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife Margaret. Heard there might be some trouble at work today. Everything okay? The palace grapevine was clearly operating at full efficiency. Margaret had worked in the palace laundry for 15 years, and she had her own network of friends among the staff. News traveled fast in the close-knit community of palace employees. He texted back quickly, "All fine, might be home late tonight. We'll explain later." Thomas didn't want to worry Margaret, but he also couldn't explain the situation over text. If things went badly, there would be plenty of time for explanations later. As 1 o'clock approached, Thomas made a decision. He walked to his small office and pulled out a notebook where he kept records of his daily activities. He began writing a detailed account of the morning's events, including his conversation with James Fletcher. If this situation escalated, he wanted to have a clear record of exactly what had happened and when. While he wrote, Thomas heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He looked up to see Sarah Mitchell, one of the palace's senior curators, approaching his office. Sarah was in her early 40s, with short brown hair and a no-nonsense attitude that had earned her respect throughout the palace. She had worked with Thomas on numerous occasions when artworks needed to be moved for cleaning or restoration. "Thomas, do you have a minute?" Sarah asked, stepping into his office. Her usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and Thomas could see worry lines around her eyes. "Of course, Sarah. What can I do for you?" Sarah closed the door behind her and sat down in the chair across from Thomas's desk. "I've heard about what's planned for this afternoon. I wanted you to know that several of us in the curatorial department have serious concerns about this decision." Thomas leaned back in his chair, interested to hear Sarah's perspective. "What kind of concerns?" "From a professional standpoint, the portrait of the Princess of Wales is one of our most popular pieces," Sarah explained. "Visitor feedback consistently shows that people specifically ask about it during tours. Removing it will definitely be noticed, and not in a good way." "Have you or your colleagues expressed these concerns to anyone in the administration?" Thomas asked. Sarah shook her head with frustration. "We tried to raise the issue through proper channels, but we were told the decision had already been made at the highest level and wasn't open for discussion. The master of the household made it clear that our job was to implement the decision, not to question it. This confirmed what Thomas had suspected about the top-down nature of the order. "What's your professional opinion about the official reason for the move?" he asked. "The reorganization explanation doesn't hold water," Sarah said bluntly.
"There's plenty of space in the gallery for additional portraits without removing existing ones. If they really wanted to display a new portrait of Queen Camilla, there are several other prominent locations that would work just as well."
Thomas appreciated Sarah's honesty. As a curator, she understood the practical and aesthetic considerations involved in displaying artwork. Her professional assessment supported his instinctive feeling that this decision was motivated by personal rather than practical considerations. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important," Thomas said, lowering his voice. "If I were to refuse to cooperate with this removal, would that create problems for you and your team?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Officially, the removal team from the Royal Collection Trust has their own security clearance and authorization. They don't technically need your assistance to access the portrait. However, your cooperation would make the process much smoother and less conspicuous." "And unofficially?" Thomas prompted. "Unofficially, if you refuse to cooperate, it will force the administration to escalate the situation. They'll have to bring in additional security personnel and make the removal much more obvious and dramatic than they probably want it to be. It might also give other staff members the courage to voice their own objections." Thomas nodded, understanding the implications. His refusal wouldn't necessarily stop the portrait from being removed, but it would make the process much more visible and potentially embarrassing for those who had ordered it. "There's something else you should know," Sarah continued. "I've heard rumors that this might not be the only change Queen Camilla is planning. There's talk about reviewing the entire royal collection and making other adjustments to better reflect the current hierarchy." This news hit Thomas like a physical blow. If true, it meant that Catherine's portrait was just the beginning of a broader campaign to diminish the visible presence of certain family members. The thought of the royal collection being used as a weapon in family politics made him feel sick to his stomach. At that moment, both Thomas and Sarah heard the sound of vehicles arriving outside the palace. Through the window, Thomas could see a large van with Royal Collection Trust painted on its side, along with two smaller cars. The removal team had arrived early. "They're here," Sarah said unnecessarily, as they both watched several people in professional uniforms getting out of the vehicles. "Thomas, whatever you decide to do, I want you to know that many of us respect your integrity. This situation isn't fair to anyone involved." Sarah left to return to her duties, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and his conscience. He could hear voices in the corridor as the removal team was escorted into the palace by James Fletcher and other administrators. The voices grew louder as they approached the portrait gallery, and Thomas knew that the moment of decision had arrived. Thomas stood up from his desk and straightened his uniform. He checked his appearance in the small mirror he kept in his office, adjusting his tie and making sure his badges were properly positioned. If he was going to take a stand, he wanted to look every inch the professional guard he had trained to be. As he walked toward the portrait gallery, Thomas thought about his daughter Emily and her studies in art history. She had grown up hearing stories about the royal collection and the important role it played in preserving British culture and history. What would he tell her if he simply stood by and allowed political considerations to override the proper stewardship of these treasures? The removal team was already in the gallery, examining Catherine's portrait and discussing the logistics of taking it down safely. There were 4 specialists from the Royal Collection Trust, along with James Fletcher and 2 other palace administrators. The team leader, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and efficient movements, was explaining to her colleagues how they would need to carefully remove the portrait from its mounting system. Thomas approached the group, and James Fletcher immediately turned to address him. "Thomas, thank you for being here. This is Helen Morrison from the Royal Collection Trust. She'll be supervising the removal process." Helen looked at Thomas with professional courtesy. "Mr. Whitmore, we'll need you to verify our authorization and witness the removal process for your records. We should have everything completed within an hour." Thomas looked around the gallery at the assembled group. Everyone was acting as if this were a routine procedure, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The other administrators avoided making eye contact with him, and even Helen seemed more formal than necessary for what should have been a standard artwork relocation. "Before we proceed," Thomas said in a clear, steady voice, "I need to see the written authorization for this removal, along with the documentation showing where the portrait will be stored and when it will be returned to display." James Fletcher's face flushed slightly with annoyance. Thomas, we've already discussed this. The authorization comes directly from Her Majesty Queen Camilla. That's all the documentation you need. I'm afraid that's not correct, sir, Thomas replied politely but firmly. Palace protocol requires written authorization with specific details for any artwork removal, regardless of who orders it. This is to ensure proper insurance coverage and security arrangements. Helen Morrison looked confused by the exchange. Is there a problem with the paperwork? I was told all the necessary approvals had been obtained. James Fletcher's face grew redder as he realized Thomas was not going to simply comply. The authorization is being processed through the proper channels. We can provide the documentation after the portrait has been safely removed and transported. I'm sorry, but that's not how the protocol works, Thomas said, maintaining his calm, professional demeanor. The documentation must be provided before any artwork is moved. As the senior guard responsible for this wing, I cannot authorize the removal without proper paperwork. The tension in the gallery was now unmistakable. The specialists from the Royal Collection Trust looked at each other uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of what was obviously a political dispute. Helen Morrison stepped forward to address the situation. Perhaps we should postpone this removal until the paperwork issues can be resolved, she suggested diplomatically. We want to ensure everything is done properly and according to protocol. That won't be necessary, said a crisp voice from the gallery entrance. Everyone turned to see Queen Camilla herself walking into the gallery, flanked by two of her personal staff members. She was dressed in a navy blue suit with her signature pearls, and her expression was one of barely controlled irritation. The portrait gallery fell into complete silence as Queen Camilla entered. Everyone present immediately straightened their posture and assumed more formal positions. Thomas felt his heart rate increase, but he maintained his professional composure as he had been trained to do during his decades of service. Queen Camilla walked directly toward the group gathered around Catherine's portrait, her heels clicking against the marble floor with sharp, deliberate sounds. Her eyes swept across the assembled staff before settling on Thomas. There was no warmth in her expression, only the cold authority of someone who was accustomed to having her orders followed without question. I understand there seems to be some confusion about the authorization for this removal, Queen Camilla said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to settling disputes through sheer force of will. I am providing that authorization personally and directly. Thomas knew this was the crucial moment. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the gallery watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. James Fletcher looked relieved that the Queen Consort had arrived to resolve the situation, while the removal specialists appeared even more uncomfortable now that they found themselves in the presence of royal drama. Your Majesty, Thomas began, maintaining proper protocol while standing his ground. I have the utmost respect for your authority. However, palace security protocols require written documentation for all artwork removals, regardless of the source of authorization. This is to protect both the royal collection and the individuals involved in handling these valuable pieces. Queen Camilla's expression hardened noticeably at Thomas's response. She was clearly not accustomed to having her direct orders questioned, especially not by a member of the palace staff. The tension in the gallery became almost unbearable as everyone waited to see how she would respond. Mr.
Whitmore, is it? Queen Camilla said, taking a step closer to Thomas. I am told you have served this family faithfully for many years. Surely you understand the importance of loyalty and obedience in maintaining the proper functioning of this household.
Yes, Your Majesty, I do understand the importance of loyalty, Thomas replied. My loyalty is to the crown, to the institution of the monarchy, and to the proper preservation and protection of the royal heritage. That's why I cannot authorize the removal of this portrait without following the established protocols. The Queen Consort's face flushed with anger at Thomas's continued resistance. She turned to James Fletcher with an expression that made it clear she expected him to resolve this situation immediately. Fletcher, I believe we need to clarify the chain of command here, Queen Camilla said in a voice that was both quiet and threatening. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore needs to be reminded of exactly who he serves and what his duties entail. James Fletcher stepped forward nervously, clearly caught between his loyalty to his superior and his recognition that Thomas was technically correct about the protocols. Your Majesty, I can certainly arrange for the proper documentation to be prepared immediately. Perhaps if we could delay the removal by just a few hours. The removal will proceed now, Queen Camilla interrupted firmly. I will not have my direct orders questioned or delayed by bureaucratic nonsense. Mr. Whitmore, you will step aside and allow these professionals to do their job. Thomas looked around the gallery, taking in the faces of everyone present. He could see fear in the eyes of the palace administrators, confusion in the faces of the removal specialists, and cold determination in Queen Camilla's expression. This was the moment that would define not just his career, but his sense of integrity and self-respect. Your Majesty, I respectfully decline to authorize this removal without proper documentation. Thomas said quietly but clearly, if you wish to proceed without following established protocols, you are free to do so, but I cannot be a party to it. The silence that followed Thomas's declaration was deafening. Queen Camilla stared at him with an expression of pure fury, while James Fletcher looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. The removal specialists exchanged glances that clearly indicated they wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Whitmore, Queen Camilla said slowly, her voice dripping with barely controlled rage. You are refusing a direct order from your queen. Do you understand the implications of your actions? I understand that I am upholding my oath of service, which requires me to protect the royal collection and follow established security protocols. Thomas replied. I believe that is exactly what my queen would want me to do. Queen Camilla's face turned an alarming shade of red, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if she might actually lose her composure completely. Instead, she turned to her personal staff members and spoke in a voice that was clearly audible to everyone present. I want Mr. Whitmore removed from his position immediately, she commanded. Have security escort him from the premises. And I want this portrait removed within the hour, with or without his cooperation. One of Queen Camilla's staff members, a young man in his 30s with a nervous expression, stepped forward to address Thomas. Sir, you'll need to come with us. You're being relieved of duty effective immediately. Thomas nodded calmly, understanding that this outcome had been inevitable from the moment he decided to take his stand. He unbuckled his ceremonial sword and handed it to James Fletcher, along with his security badge and keys. The weight of giving up these symbols of his position hit him emotionally, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Fletcher, you'll find my duty logs are completely up to date in my office, Thomas said professionally. All security protocols for this wing are documented in the files. As Thomas prepared to leave, Helen Morrison from the Royal Collection Trust stepped forward hesitantly. Your Majesty, perhaps we should reconsider proceeding without proper documentation. Our insurance policies are very specific about following established protocols. Queen Camilla wheeled around to face Helen with obvious irritation. Are you questioning my authority as well? Helen backed down quickly, realizing she had stepped into dangerous territory. Not at all, Your Majesty. We'll proceed as you've instructed. As Thomas was being escorted from the gallery, he took one last look at Catherine's portrait. The gentle smile and kind eyes that had welcomed thousands of visitors to the palace seemed to be looking directly at him, and for a moment, he felt certain he had made the right choice. The walk through the palace corridors to the main exit felt surreal to Thomas. Staff members they passed stopped what they were doing and stared as they realized what was happening. Word traveled fast in the palace, and by the time Thomas reached the main entrance, a small crowd of colleagues had gathered to witness his departure. Among the crowd, Thomas spotted his wife, Margaret, who must have heard about the situation through the palace grapevine. Her face was pale with worry, but she gave him a small nod of support that meant more to him than any words could have expressed. He also saw Sarah Mitchell, the curator, standing near the back of the group with tears in her eyes. As Thomas stepped outside the palace gates for the last time as an employee, he felt a mixture of sadness and relief. 23 years of faithful service had ended in disgrace, at least from the official perspective. But he knew in his heart that he had remained true to his principles and his oath of service, even when it cost him everything. The media presence outside the palace was heavier than usual that day, though Thomas didn't know if this was related to a situation or some other royal news. As he walked away from the palace, he could hear the click of camera shutters and the voices of reporters, but he kept his head up and maintained his dignity. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter Emily at university. Dad, I heard something happened at work. I'm proud of you no matter what.
Somehow, Emily had already heard about the situation, which meant news was spreading beyond the palace walls faster than anyone had expected. As he walked through the streets of London, Thomas reflected on what had just happened. He had lost his career, his pension might be in jeopardy, and he would probably never work in royal service again. But he had stood up for what he believed was right, and he had refused to be a part of what felt like a petty and vindictive act against someone who deserved better. Thomas thought about Catherine and the kindness she had always shown to the palace staff. He remembered the way she would stop to chat with the guards and housekeepers, asking about their families and remembering details from previous conversations. She had brought a human touch to the formal world of the palace, and her portrait had symbolized that warmth for everyone who saw it. The removal of the portrait would send a clear message about the new direction of the monarchy under Queen Camilla's influence. It would show that personal grudges and petty jealousies were more important than maintaining the dignity and unity that the royal family was supposed to represent. Thomas couldn't be a part of that, even if it meant sacrificing his career. As he made his way home to face an uncertain future, Thomas felt strangely at peace with his decision. He had remained loyal to the true spirit of the monarchy, even when that meant disobeying a direct order from the queen consort. History would judge whether he had made the right choice, but he could live with the consequences knowing he had acted with integrity. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the removal of Catherine's portrait proceeded under heavy security and with minimal staff present. The image that had welcomed visitors and symbolized the future of the monarchy was carefully taken down and loaded into the van from the Royal Collection Trust. By evening, the space where it had hung was empty, leaving only a slightly darker rectangle on the wall to mark where it had been. The palace administration worked quickly to control the narrative about Thomas's dismissal, releasing a brief statement about a staff member being relieved of duty for insubordination. But among the palace staff, a different story was being told. One about a man who had stood up for his principles even when it cost him everything he had worked for over more than 2 decades of faithful service. The events of that day would have consequences far beyond what anyone present in the portrait gallery could have imagined. The removal of Catherine's portrait and Thomas's stand against it would become symbols of the deeper conflicts brewing within the royal family, conflicts that would eventually spill into public view and challenge the very foundations of the modern monarchy. Thomas Whitmore had become an unlikely hero in a story that was far from over. His refusal to follow an order he believed was wrong had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the tensions and divisions that threatened to tear the royal family apart. The portrait of Catherine, Princess of Wales, would indeed find its way back to public view, but not in the way anyone expected, and Thomas's role in that story was far from finished. 3 days after Thomas Whitmore's dismissal from royal service, the story began to leak beyond the palace walls. It started with whispered conversations among palace staff members who had witnessed the dramatic confrontation in the portrait gallery. These whispers reached the ears of retired royal staff members who maintained contact with their former colleagues, and from there, the story spread to royal reporters who had cultivated sources within the palace over many years. The first article appeared in a small royal watching blog on Thursday morning. The headline read, "Royal Guard dismissed after refusing order to remove Catherine's portrait." The story was short and lacked many details, but it contained enough specific information to make it clear that the blogger had received insider information. Within hours, the story had been picked up by larger news outlets, and by Friday morning, it was front-page news in several British newspapers. Thomas was at home trying to adjust to his new reality when his phone started ringing constantly with calls from journalists. He had turned off the ringer and was letting all calls go to voicemail, but the persistent buzzing was a constant reminder of how his quiet life had suddenly become the center of a media storm. Margaret sat at their kitchen table reading the morning newspapers with a mixture of pride and worry. "Thomas, you need to see this," she said, holding up the front page of the Daily Telegraph. The headline read, "Palace Guard Stand, Hero or Insubordinate?" Below, it was a photo of Thomas in his ceremonial uniform, taken at a state function several years earlier. Thomas looked at the newspaper with amazement. He had expected his dismissal to be handled quietly, with perhaps a brief mention in the court circular. Instead, his story was being treated as major news, with detailed accounts of the confrontation and analysis of its implications for the royal family. "They're calling you a hero, Thomas," Margaret said, though her voice carried concern rather than celebration. "But what does this mean for us?"
For your pension? For our future? Before Thomas could answer, their daughter Emily called from university. Her voice was excited but worried as she spoke rapidly into the phone. Dad, everyone here is talking about you. The story is all over social media. There are hashtags and everything. #Royal Guard Hero and #Save Catherine's Portrait are trending on Twitter. But are you okay? Are you in trouble? Thomas tried to calm his daughter's concerns while processing the fact that his story had somehow become a social media phenomenon. He had barely used Twitter himself, but Emily explained that thousands of people were sharing the story and expressing support for his actions. Many comments criticized Queen Camilla's decision to remove Catherine's portrait, viewing it as petty and vindictive. The media attention intensified over the weekend. Television news programs ran segments about the incident, often accompanied by expert commentary about royal family dynamics and palace politics. Former royal staff members were interviewed, with many expressing support for Thomas's position while carefully avoiding direct criticism of Queen Camilla. On Sunday morning, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Mitchell, the palace curator who had spoken with him before the confrontation, arrived at his front door looking nervous but determined. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweatshirt, clearly off-duty from her palace position. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Thomas asked, inviting her into his living room. "You shouldn't be seen associating with me. It could jeopardize your job." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I couldn't stay silent any longer. What happened to you was wrong, and the removal of Catherine's portrait was a mistake. Several of us in the curatorial department are prepared to speak out about it." Thomas was shocked by this revelation. "Sarah, you can't risk your career over this. I made my choice, but you don't have to make the same sacrifice." "It's not just about you, Thomas," Sarah explained. "What happened in the portrait gallery was just the beginning. We've received a list of other changes Queen Camilla wants to make to the royal collection. Several other portraits and artifacts related to Catherine and William are being targeted for removal or relocation." This news confirmed Thomas's worst fears about the situation. The removal of Catherine's portrait wasn't an isolated incident but part of a broader campaign to diminish the visible presence of the future king and queen in the palace's public spaces. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "We've heard that Prince William and Catherine themselves were not informed about the removal of the portrait until after it happened. Apparently, Prince William was furious when he found out and demanded a meeting with his father." Thomas felt a surge of validation hearing this news. If the future king and his wife were opposed to the removal, it confirmed that Queen Camilla had acted unilaterally, without consulting the broader royal family. This suggested that the decision was motivated by personal feelings rather than official policy. "Has anything been decided about the other changes on the list?" Thomas asked. Sarah nodded grimly. "Several items are scheduled to be moved next week. But there's growing resistance among the staff. Your stand gave others courage to speak up about their concerns." As Sarah prepared to leave, she handed Thomas a folder containing copies of emails and documents related to the planned changes to the royal collection. "I thought you should see these. They show the scope of what's being planned." That afternoon, Thomas sat in his study reviewing the documents Sarah had provided. The list of planned changes was extensive and clearly targeted. Portraits, photographs, and personal items connected to William and Catherine were being systematically relocated to less prominent positions or removed from public display entirely. At the same time, new commissions were planned to increase Queen Camilla's visual presence throughout the palace. The pattern was unmistakable, and Thomas realized he had uncovered evidence of a deliberate campaign to reshape the visual narrative of the monarchy. This wasn't about reorganization or making space for new additions. It was about establishing dominance and controlling the story being told through the palace's artistic collection. On Monday morning, Thomas received a call from his former colleague, David Patterson, another senior guard who had served alongside him for over 15 years. David's voice was tense as he explained the situation at the palace. "Thomas, things are getting complicated here," David said. "The administration is trying to present a united front, but there are clearly divisions among the staff. Some people are afraid to speak up, while others are openly expressing support for what you did." "How is the atmosphere in the portrait gallery?" Thomas asked. "Strange," David replied. "The empty space where Catherine's portrait hung has become almost like a shrine. Visitors ask about it constantly, and the tour guides don't know how to respond. Some staff members have started placing small flowers near the empty wall. This image touched Thomas deeply. The idea that people were mourning the absence of Catherine's portrait confirmed his belief that its removal had been a mistake that went far beyond palace politics. "There's something else you should know," David continued. "There are rumors that senior members of the royal family are planning to intervene. Apparently, King Charles is under pressure to address the situation before it causes more damage to the monarchy's reputation." That evening, Thomas and Margaret were watching the television news when a breaking news bulletin interrupted the regular programming. The royal correspondent announced that Buckingham Palace would be releasing a statement about recent changes to the royal collection. The statement, read by a palace spokesperson, was carefully worded but significant. "His Majesty the King has directed that all changes to the display of the royal collection be reviewed to ensure they reflect the proper dignity and respect due to all members of the royal family. Any items that have been recently relocated will be reviewed for potential return to their previous positions." Thomas felt a wave of emotion as he heard these words. While the statement didn't mention him specifically or directly criticize Queen Camilla's actions, it was clearly a response to the controversy surrounding Catherine's portrait. The fact that the king himself had intervened suggested that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had initially expected. Margaret reached over and squeezed Thomas's hand. "It sounds like you might have won after all," she said softly. But Thomas knew the situation was more complex than simply winning or losing. His career was still over, his reputation within royal circles was damaged, and the underlying tensions that had caused the conflict remained unresolved. However, he had succeeded in drawing attention to what he believed was an injustice, and it appeared that his sacrifice had prompted a reconsideration of the policies that had led to the controversy. Over the following days, the media attention gradually shifted from Thomas's personal story to the broader implications of the incident for the royal family. Royal experts debated the significance of the king's intervention and what it revealed about the power dynamics within the monarchy. Some commentators suggested that Queen Camilla had overstepped her authority, while others argued that she was simply trying to establish her proper position as queen consort. The most significant development came on Thursday, exactly 1 week after Thomas's dismissal. The palace announced that Catherine's portrait would be restored to its original position in the portrait gallery as part of a comprehensive review of the royal collection. The announcement was made without fanfare, buried in the daily court circular, but its significance was not lost on those who had been following the story. Thomas learned about the restoration from Sarah Mitchell, who called him with the news. "It's going back up this afternoon," she said, unable to hide the excitement in her voice. "The same removal team is returning, but this time they're bringing it back from storage. Will there be any ceremony or acknowledgement of what happened?" Thomas asked. "No, they're trying to handle it as quietly as possible," Sarah replied. "But everyone here knows what this means. Your stand made this happen, Thomas." That afternoon, Thomas felt compelled to visit the area around Buckingham Palace. He couldn't enter the palace or see the portrait gallery, but he wanted to be nearby when Catherine's portrait was restored to its rightful place. As he stood across the street from the palace gates, he reflected on the events of the past week and their broader significance. He had lost his career and his position, but he had remained true to his principles. More importantly, his actions had drawn attention to an injustice and ultimately helped to correct it. The portrait of Catherine, Princess of Wales, would once again welcome visitors to the palace and serve as a symbol of the monarchy's future. Thomas understood that this was likely just one battle in a longer war over the direction and character of the royal family. The underlying tensions between different factions within the monarchy had not been resolved by the restoration of a single portrait. But for now, he could take satisfaction in knowing that he had stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. 6 months after the portrait controversy, Thomas Whitmore sat in a small coffee shop near his home, reading the morning newspaper. The headlines were focused on other royal news, upcoming state visit, and preparations for a major charity event hosted by Prince William and Catherine. The portrait incident had faded from public attention, but its effects continued to ripple through the royal establishment. Thomas's life had settled into a new routine. After 23 years of the structured formal world of palace service, civilian life had required significant adjustment. Margaret had been incredibly supportive during the transition, and their daughter Emily had become something of a local celebrity at university, known as the daughter of the guard who stood up to Queen Camilla. The financial implications of Thomas's dismissal had been less severe than initially feared. While he had lost his palace position and the pension benefits that came with it, several job offers had emerged from the media attention surrounding his story. A private security firm specializing in protecting art collections had offered him a senior position, recognizing that his experience and demonstrated integrity made him valuable to their clients. More surprisingly, Thomas had been approached by the National Trust to serve as a security consultant for their historic properties. The organization was impressed by his willingness to stand up for proper protocols and wanted to benefit from his expertise in protecting cultural treasures. The salary was actually higher than what he had earned at the palace, and the work allowed him to continue serving the public interest in preserving British heritage. On this particular morning, Thomas's peaceful breakfast was interrupted by a phone call from an unexpected source. The caller identified himself as private secretary to the Prince of Wales, and he requested a meeting with Thomas at his earliest convenience. "Sir, may I ask what this meeting would concern?" Thomas inquired, surprised by the call. "His Royal Highness would like to speak with you personally about the events that occurred at the palace earlier this year," the secretary explained. "Prince William has expressed a desire to meet with you privately to discuss the situation." Thomas felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity about this request. He had wondered whether Prince William and Catherine had been informed about his role in the portrait controversy, and apparently, they had not only been informed, but wanted to meet with him personally. 2 days later, Thomas found himself in the elegant drawing room of Kensington Palace, waiting to meet with the future king. The room was decorated with beautiful artwork and family photographs, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a family home than a royal residence. Thomas was dressed in his best suit, feeling somewhat underdressed for the palace setting but wanting to maintain his dignity. Prince William entered the room with a warm smile and an extended hand. At 39 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of someone comfortable with his royal duties, but his manner was relaxed and approachable. Thomas was struck by how much the prince resembled his late mother in his gentle demeanor and genuine interest in others. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming," Prince William said, gesturing for Thomas to sit in one of the comfortable armchairs. "I've wanted to meet with you for some time to express my personal gratitude for what you did." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the prince's gracious manner. "Your Royal Highness, I was simply doing what I believed was right according to my oath of service. That's exactly why I wanted to meet with you," Prince William replied, settling into the chair across from Thomas. "In all the years I've been involved with royal duties, I've seen many people who follow orders without question, but very few who are willing to stand up for their principles when it matters most." The prince went on to explain that he and Catherine had indeed been kept in the dark about the plan to remove her portrait. They had only learned about it after the fact, and Prince William had been deeply disturbed by both the decision itself and the manner in which it had been implemented. "The portrait isn't just a painting to us," Prince William explained. "It represents Catherine's role in the future of the monarchy and the values we want to embody. Its removal felt like an attack on everything we're trying to build for the future of this institution." Thomas listened intently as the prince described the behind-the-scenes efforts to address the situation. The king had indeed intervened, but only after Prince William had demanded answers about what had happened. The meeting between father and son had been tense, with Prince William making it clear that such unilateral actions could not be allowed to continue. "Your stand forced the issue into the open," Prince William said. "Without your refusal to cooperate, the portrait would have disappeared quietly, and we might never have known what happened until much later. You gave us the opportunity to address the situation before it caused irreparable damage." The conversation turned to the broader implications of the incident for the royal family. Prince William was frank about the challenges they faced in managing different personalities and competing visions within the monarchy. He acknowledged that tensions existed but emphasized the importance of maintaining unity and dignity in public. "The monarchy belongs to the British people, not to any individual member of the royal family," Prince William said. "When personal feelings start to override our duty to serve the public interest, we all suffer. Your actions reminded us of that important principle." Thomas was moved by the prince's honesty and his clear commitment to serving the public rather than pursuing personal agendas. It confirmed his belief that standing up for Catherine's portrait had been about more than just one painting. It had been about preserving the integrity of the institution itself. "Sir, may I ask about the current situation with the royal collection?" Thomas inquired. "I've heard there were other changes planned beyond the portrait." Prince William nodded with a serious expression. "The review ordered by my father resulted in all of those plans being suspended indefinitely. The policies governing changes to the royal collection have been revised to require consultation with senior family members before any significant modifications are made." This news provided Thomas with a sense of vindication. His sacrifice had not only restored Catherine's portrait, but had also prevented other potentially damaging changes to the royal collection. As their meeting drew to a close, Prince William made an unexpected request. "Mr. Whitmore, I would like to invite you and your family to be our guests at the next garden party at Buckingham Palace. It would give Catherine and me the opportunity to thank you properly for your service." Thomas was deeply honored by this invitation, but felt compelled to decline politely. "Your Royal Highness, I am incredibly grateful for the invitation, but I think it would be best if I maintained a low profile. My appearance at a royal event might draw unwanted attention to the incident and could cause embarrassment for the family." Prince William smiled at Thomas's thoughtfulness. "I understand your concern, but I want you to know that the invitation stands whenever you feel comfortable accepting it. Your integrity and service deserve recognition, not hiding." Before leaving Kensington Palace, Thomas was surprised to encounter Catherine herself in the corridor. The Princess of Wales was even more gracious and warm in person than she appeared in public, and she took time to thank Thomas personally for his actions. "I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to risk your career for something you believed in," Catherine said. "Your willingness to stand up for what's right gives me hope for the future of our country." The drive home from Kensington Palace gave Thomas time to reflect on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 6 months earlier, he had been a relatively anonymous palace guard whose biggest concerns involved daily security routines and maintaining protocol. Now he had become an unlikely symbol of integrity and had earned the personal gratitude of the future king and queen. That evening, Thomas shared the details of his meeting with Margaret and Emily, who had driven down from university for the weekend. Both women were amazed by the prince's gracious response and the invitation to the garden party. "Dad, you have to go to that garden party eventually," Emily insisted. "This is history. You stood up to power and made a difference. People need to know that ordinary citizens can still make a difference when they're willing to take a stand." Margaret agreed with their daughter. "Thomas, you've spent your whole career serving others and staying in the background. Maybe it's time to accept some recognition for what you've accomplished." Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself reflecting more deeply on the broader implications of his experience. The incident had revealed important truths about power, integrity, and the responsibility of individuals to stand up for their principles even when facing overwhelming pressure to conform. Thomas began accepting speaking invitations from civic organizations and schools, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of individual integrity in serving the public good. His message resonated particularly strongly with young people, who saw his story as proof that one person could still make a difference in the face of institutional power. The portrait of Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained in its prominent position in the palace portrait gallery, greeting visitors with the same gentle smile that had inspired Thomas to take his stand. Tour guides now often mention the painting's brief removal and restoration as an example of how public attention could influence royal decisions, though they rarely mention Thomas by name. A year after the incident, Thomas received another call from Kensington Palace. This time it was Catherine herself, calling to invite Thomas and his family to attend a special reception for people who had performed exceptional public service. The event would be small and private, focused on recognizing individuals who had made significant contributions to British society. This time, Thomas accepted the invitation. Standing in the elegant reception room at Kensington Palace, surrounded by teachers, healthcare workers, charity volunteers, and other public servants, Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction. His refusal to remove Catherine's portrait had been vindicated not just by its restoration, but by the broader changes it had prompted in how the royal collection was managed. As he shook hands with Prince William and Catherine during the reception, Thomas reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. He had lost a job but gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he had remained true to his principles when it mattered most. The controversy over Catherine's portrait had faded from public attention, but its lessons remained relevant. Thomas's story continued to inspire others who face difficult choices between personal security and moral principles. His example demonstrated that integrity and courage could still triumph over petty politics and personal ambition, even within the most powerful institutions. In the end, Thomas Whitmore had achieved something far more significant than simply protecting a painting. He had helped preserve the dignity and integrity of the monarchy itself, ensuring that future generations would inherit an institution worthy of their respect and loyalty. The gentle smile in Catherine's portrait would continue to welcome visitors to the palace, serving as a reminder that sometimes the most important victories come from the courage to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost.